here tonight, but they're available at your local bookseller, and we'll be able to promote those with you. So at this time, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Dr. David Stahel.
Well, may I just say, I hope I'm coming through loud and clear and that you can all hear and see me. First of all, I just want to begin by saying thank you very much to George for this gracious introduction. And my compliments to the USS Silversides Museum. I think it's USS 393, is it? And the Muskegon Community College for all the work they've put into hosting me here tonight. Yes, indeed, George is right. My specialization is Operation Barbarossa, and that's what I want to talk to you all about tonight. To begin with, I want to start by framing this operation. I think for a lot of people in the Anglo-American world, this is a new part of the war. The parts that we're more familiar with are the parts that I'm sure a lot of the veterans there have talked about, and I see it in your wonderful brochure here, just exactly what you've been looking at. It's very important, but I think Barbarossa is important because this is really Hitler's main war. And a lot of the figures that George just went through there really underline that. But two of the things I want to use to frame Barbarossa are, first of all, scale. Now, George has hit on that with some of those figures, but I just want to reiterate one or two things. If we look at North Africa, for example, this is the place where I think you see the most famous German general of the Second World War. I'm sure many of you have heard of Erwin Rommel. And he, of course, commanded the Afrika Korps, which fought in North Africa from the beginning of 1941 right through to 1943. He's a famous general. This is a famous area of campaign. Not surprisingly for us, we have British forces serving there, Australians, South Africans, New Zealanders, and of course with the torch landings, the United States will be fighting in North Africa against Rommel. So he's a very famous commander. Yet really, what is the Afrika Korps? It consists of 3 divisions, a corps, 3 divisions. That comes to, in layman's terms, about 48,000 men on paper. Actually, in practice, in the summer of 1941, the figure is around about 40,000. Large numbers of sick and wounded and so on. So we're talking about 40,000 men. What is the Eastern Front in June 1941? That is the entire Ostheer, the Eastern Army. And that consists of in excess of 140 divisions. Depends on whether you count security divisions and mountain divisions and all these things, but in excess of 140 divisions. That comes to, according to the German official histories, we have 3.3 million men. Now, George's figure was somewhat higher there, but that doesn't include, that 3.3 million men, Axis allies. For example, Romania is involved in this. They have 320,000 men contributing to Barbarossa from the 22nd of June. We also have the Finnish army in the north, 450,000 men. So already there, we've got over 4 million. If you take the German forces plus Axis allies, and then there's others who come just after the declaration of war. The Hungarians don't want to be outdone by the Romanians. If there's lots to be divided up at the peace table, they don't want to be left out. They also have a rivalry with the Romanians, so they'll contribute a corps, 60,000 men. Mussolini wants to have a part of this too. He wants to contribute to the anti-Bolshevik crusade. He contributes 60,000 men. The Slovakians are there. We have Waffen-SS, volunteers from all over Europe, and indeed there's even a division from neutral Spain. Whenever you read that Spain is neutral in World War II, that's a quasi-neutrality at best. They're giving lots of intelligence to the Axis. They're not officially in the Axis and they never join the war, but there's a whole division of Spanish volunteers on the Eastern Front. The basic point is this is warfare on a scale we have never seen before. It is unprecedented. We are talking millions of men clashing together, and that in the first instance is one of the most important things that you have to take away from Barbarossa, to understand its place in the Second World War, particularly, I think, for the Anglo-American world, because we are naturally studying our own history. So we hear about what Americans did, we hear about what Australians did, about what the British did, and that's certainly a very important part of the war, there's no denying that, and we fight on many different fronts. Of course, North Africa is perhaps one of the more famous ones, but there's the bombing of Germany going throughout the war, so there's veterans who've served there, there's the Battle of the Atlantic, bringing supplies across, fighting against these U-boats, there's the landings in Italy as of 1943. There's, of course, D-Day and all the campaigns in Western Europe, 44, 45. So we have these stories. We have, of course, the whole Pacific War. But what we need to remember in both the Pacific and in Europe is that the real war Japan is fighting is in China. actually. And they've been fighting that war since 1937. It's a major war for them. It's not to say the Pacific isn't important, but the numbers are smaller. And on the Eastern Front, this is the overwhelming bulk of German forces concentrated there. And that will be the case for the rest of the war. Never less than 75% of the German army will be concentrated anywhere but in the East. And the losses are appalling for both sides. But remember, by the time the Allies land in France in June 1944, the Eastern Front has been raging and devouring manpower. The Wehrmacht is a shadow of what it once was after 3 years of tumultuous fighting on the Eastern Front. So the first thing I wanted to impress upon you was scale. The second thing is what I broadly term intensity. It's a difficult thing to understand, but it needs to be emphasized that the Eastern Front is not like warfare elsewhere. The German Wehrmacht, for all that it is, and the Nazi state, for all that we know about that, is not treating Western prisoners of war as they will Soviet prisoners of war. We talk in German about a Vernichtungskrieg, a war of annihilation. That is to say, the German army, very much the German army, as well as elements of the Nazi state, are operating in the East with a ruthlessness they don't necessarily have in other parts of Europe against Western forces. And to illustrate this with some of the statistics, and I won't bore you all night with statistics, there are 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war taken in 1941 alone. And of that 3.3 million, 60% are dead by February 1942. And I think that underlines, that's a figure of roughly about 2 million. And that is not by accident. It's not the same as the Holocaust. They're not necessarily killing them deliberately in gas chambers or so, but the neglect and planned neglect of the German army for these Soviet prisoners of war, their well-being, their welfare. In other words, putting them into large, you might say, camps, but they're so basic, they're literally open fields with barbed wire around them. They are in there, they are not fed, they are not housed. There's diseases, there's starvation, and of course by the autumn and the winter in these extreme conditions, you can see masses of them dying. Some camps literally cease to exist because every single last inmate has died. This is a feature and only one aspect of the war of annihilation in the East. And there are other aspects to this. The German Wehrmacht are involved in what we call the criminal orders. There are multiple criminal orders, but just to give you an example, any captured commissar on the authority of a lieutenant can be shot, and indeed must be shot. It's an order. It must be fulfilled. One of the problems with understanding this war of annihilation, and it's a problem some of you may encounter if you do any research on this, you would think, going to an obvious source, a primary source, like a German general's memoir, you can find out more about what's going on in the East. Let me tell you, these memoirs that the German generals wrote are very often problematic in the sense that they don't tell you really what took place in the East. The whole war of annihilation was, you can imagine, quite taboo after the war, and the German generals are trying to reinvent themselves as possible. I mean, some of them take jobs in the US military, for example, writing manuals on the Soviets. This is now highly relevant to the United States military and indeed to the West. And so they don't advertise what they did. And they'll very often misrepresent their entire role by saying, no, Commissar order, we never passed that on. Yes, it existed, but in my command, it was never passed on. Well, that debate has been raging for the last 65 years about just to what extent was the Commissar order implemented, but the most recent research by a brilliant young German historian called Felix Römer, who's just come up with an 800-page book, and he spent I don't know how many years in Freiburg, which that's where the German military archive was, went through everything in 1941-42 and basically concluded 80% of German divisions in the East, Wehrmacht, we're not talking about the SS, we're talking about the Wehrmacht, implemented the Kommissarbefehl, the Kommissar order, and that there is direct evidence of this. So we're getting a sense from all of this of the intensity, the way in which this war was fought. And if you imagine a large army like the Wehrmacht, and the large number of Soviet people who die ultimately in this war, and just to give you a figure on that, they differ, but we're talking about 27 to 28 million people will die in the Soviet Union during the course of the Second World War. All of this underlines the enormity of this war, and indeed the importance of understanding it for understanding how Germany lost the Second World War. And that's what I want to talk a bit about. So the beginning picks up from one of the points that, that George made there, and that is to underline what was the prehistory to Operation Barbarossa. Now, George has mentioned a lot of really good points there. I will reiterate one or two of them. Russia was defeated, of course, in the First World War. They backed the Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. That didn't go well. Spain fell to the nationalists. In the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact preceding the Second World War, or the invasion of Poland, the Soviet Union was allocated the eastern parts of Poland, but even when they had to invade Poland from the east on the 17th of September 1939, some of the Red Army units couldn't reach their objectives, which didn't exactly afford them a very high standing in the eyes of Wehrmacht commanders. And of course, George has mentioned the purges. There was a tremendous reorganization of the Red Army after 1940, and that is still very much taking place when the German army attacks in 1941. All of that, I restate, just to make the point that from a 2014 perspective, sometimes students say to me, oh, but it looks, like the Germans must have been crazy to do this. Why would you attack the Soviet Union? First of all, there's Napoleon and Charles XII. There's other examples of people who have invaded and not done terribly well. But of course, the one thing we all know is the Soviet Union will come out of this a superpower and be so for the next 40, 50 years. And it seems like a bad idea. That's not how it looked at the time. And of course, the other side to that coin is the German Wehrmacht. When Hitler takes power, the German army is limited to 100,000 men, and by the summer of 1941, we have Germany really dominating Europe. This Wehrmacht, with this so-called blitzkrieg style of warfare, seems unstoppable. And the best example of that is the fall of France. If you've lived in those times and you have what I sometimes refer to as an historical imagination, if you can sort of picture the events as they stood then without knowing what comes afterwards, it must have been shocking, and it was certainly shocking to the people of the world then to see France fallen in 6 weeks. If you've had, and many people had, lived through the First World War, and you know that this Western Front will be consuming German manpower, the idea that the German Wehrmacht could end that war and expel the British Expeditionary Force, as well as invade Belgium, Holland, and Luxembourg at the same time, sweep through all of them. At the same time, they've taken Poland, they're in Denmark, they're in Norway, and in 1941 they'll extend right through the Balkans, as George has just said. They're in North Africa. It does seem as though the German Wehrmacht is unstoppable, and that is reflected in the German General Staff's planning of Operation Barbarossa. Yes, they allocated a lot of resources to this campaign, but there were still fundamental problems with it. And I will try and illustrate that to you with one example. We don't, obviously, with 1 hour, have a great deal of time for going through the planning stage. But in November 1940, Wagner, he is the quartermaster general. So he is the man who has to organize the resources within the German General Staff to realize any operation that they may plan. Wagner goes to Helder. He is the chief of the German General Staff. He is the man who oversees the planning. So these are very important people within the German army. And Wagner basically says, if you want to invade the Soviet Union, and we have a force of 2 million men, so a lot less than will ultimately take part in this, 2 million men, 300,000 horses, that is half the number that they will ultimately have for the invasion. They will have 600,000 horses, and 500,000 motor vehicles. We can only penetrate into the Soviet Union some 700 to 800 kilometers. Now, don't worry about how far that is, but basically that is just east of Smolensk. I know your geography probably doesn't allow you to picture that in your head, but if I tell you from the German-Soviet border to Moscow, Smolensk is about 2/3 of the way. So what Wagner is telling Helder is we can get roughly, in best case scenario, 2/3, a little bit more than 2/3 of the way to Moscow, but that is with a radically reduced army. Ultimately, as they gather forces in the east, they will be invading with a far larger army. And already here, one sees there are fundamental problems with the realization of this operation. I think this is also important because in the history of Operation Barbarossa, anything you are likely to read before the last perhaps 10 years, a lot of the books will tell the story of the summer of 1941 as fantastically successful. And understandably, military historians are impressed by Barbarossa because it is unprecedented. The Germans are going to be capturing vast tracts of territory in very short periods of time, and the Soviet casualties are astronomical. I mean, you heard my figure there of 3.3 million prisoners of war. What nation in history has ever sustained so many losses and continued to maintain an active fighting front? Well, the Soviet Union does that. And that's, I think, another thing that's got to be understood about this war in the East. The benchmarks completely, well, by any benchmark of military history, this is a whole new standard. This is a whole new level of warfare. So we have here an enormous, high-intensity war with large numbers of German soldiers involved. It's planned as a blitzkrieg. What does that mean? That means that this war has got to be fought over a very short period of time. High intensity, super rapid movement, but ultimately a conclusion. The German General Staff is not planning for a long war here. They're not looking to wear Stalin down. They are looking to crush the Red Army and win this. The estimates vary from 6 to 10 weeks. So that will take us to the end of the summer and maybe the early part of the autumn. But then it has to end for very, very good reasons. And some of those George has just mentioned, looking at, well, how does this German war economy function? You've got to have a large number of workers to service an industry that is trying to produce everything from submarines, aircraft, because they're fighting in lots of different theatres, and they need to have a very broad weapons production program. So the way in which it has worked preceding Barbarossa is soldiers serve in the army for intensive short campaigns like the French campaign, and then after these campaigns, some of these men are demobilized, sent back to the factories or to the mines or to wherever to serve in the war economy. They're going to need to compete long-term against the British Empire, and the British Empire with Canada and New Zealand and Australia and all those resources from that whole empire, which are gathering strength and over time will favour them. There's also a continental blockade. Hitler is blockaded, as he was in the First World War. That didn't go well for Germany in the First World War, but it's different in the Second World War because the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, again this Nazi-Soviet pact preceding the Second World War or the invasion of Poland, that gives Germany raw materials and large numbers of them from the Soviet Union. And without that, that means Germany is indeed in the grip of a continental blockade. That shouldn't matter to Hitler because he's going to be seizing these resources shortly. But it does again underline the point, what happens if that doesn't work? If this is not a short campaign, the implications for the German war economy are dramatic. This must end in one brief campaign. So what happens in the summer of 1941, and what is my contribution to this history? I did my PhD as George said, at the Humboldt University, and I intensively studied the summer of 1941. That was the subject of my first book. And what's interesting is that story of Barbarossa as fantastically successful. On the one hand, absolutely true. No one can deny those figures. On the other hand, if you bear in mind all that I just said, Germany must win this war in the summer of 1941 or latest in the autumn because economically they don't have raw materials, they can't compete against a blockade, and they simply cannot sustain a high-intensity war in the East, which is devouring German manpower at a rapid rate, as well as build up more material because they'll be losing it in the East. They cannot do this long-term. This has dramatic implications for the German war effort. They must end it in the summer of 41. So what I did is I looked at the panzer groups, and this is a very important point for understanding success or failure in the summer of 1941. Panzer groups, well, better said, the German Eastern Army consists really of two armies, okay? It's not one army, it's two armies. One are represented by these panzer groups. There are 4 of these panzer groups. These are a small elite force within this Ostheer. When I say small, we're talking about 30 divisions. That represents all 4 of these panzer groups. One of the panzer groups is in Army Group South, 2 of them in Army Group Center, and 1 of them in Army Group North. These are the implements of Barbarossa. They drive the German army forward into the Soviet Union. They are kind of like, perhaps an analogy would be a spear. If you imagine the tip of the spear, the cutting edge, the steel part, that's the panzer groups. And the shaft of the spear, the real weight, the backbone, the driver of that spear, the weight behind it, that's the infantry divisions, and that's the second part of this army. One is panzer groups, the other part is the infantry. Now remember what I said at the beginning, 140 divisions. Now if we're saying 30 of those are the panzer groups, the motorized divisions, the panzer divisions, the whole rest of that are largely infantry divisions. And the infantry divisions are foot marching infantry with wagons, carrying all their supplies. They move at the speed not unlike Napoleon's army of 1812. They literally march into the Soviet Union. There is not this, and sometimes you see this represented in some of the more popular literature, well, when I say popular, I mean not such good literature, that the German army was this mechanized juggernaut driving around Europe, conquering all before it. It certainly was mechanized. there were these panzer groups, but the large bulk of the German army, they could not motorize in the 1940s, the early 1940s, 3.3 million men and have them driving around the Soviet Union. So you have, from the beginning of Barbarossa, two armies invading. From the very beginning, these panzer groups are going to shoot out, they're going to cut through the Soviet front lines, and they're going to enact this encirclement maneuvers that are going to crush Russian armies. And that's very successful. But we have to understand that marching behind them at the pace that a man can march are the real bulk of the German army. And this is going to be a problem, because the first encirclement from Army Group Center, this is the largest of the three German army groups with the overwhelming bulk of the men. It has two of the four panzer groups. The first encirclement is at Minsk. Now, we say the Battle of Minsk. That's what historians use. We do this a lot. And it gives, I think, lay people, so everyday people, the impression, this is a city in Belarus, so it's a battle taking place in the city. Actually, what we do in the East is we give it these names, like the Battle of Minsk, when we're meaning much, much larger areas of operation. So really, this is the Battle of Belarus. That's a very large country. It's a country today. It wasn't then. It was a part of the Soviet Union. But it's a very large area. Virgin forests, marshes, not exactly the best area for tanks to operate through, but there are roads, and they are driving down them, and they do enact a large encirclement and destroy just short of 300,000 Soviet soldiers. But the mentality of the Panzertrooper, the Panzer Group commanders, is forward attack. Never let your enemy recover his balance. Keep attacking, attacking, attacking. Super aggressive. And so once they have encircled Minsk in the first 10 days of the operation, they are now 1/3 of the way to Moscow. It seems to be going swimmingly, this whole campaign. They then want to break out to the east. Again, they've encircled. Now they want to drive out, and they're going to drive on the city of Smolensk. And hence, we have the next battle of the Eastern Campaign. The next major battle is the Battle of Smolensk. And we're going to come to that. But what's important is, between the Battle of Minsk ending and the beginnings of this Battle of Smolensk, there's an important document that's in the Army Group Center War Diary that I want to read out. And I'm sure the context of this will be made clear to you if you have in your mind that there are these two armies invading. I'll read it out to you. It's a translation. The problem, appearing from now on in its full magnitude, which must be the constant worry of all responsible departments of the Army Group Command, is the daily widening of the distance between the panzer groups and the infantry armies. While until now this distance has had relatively little effect, the early renewal of the advance by the panzer groups, with an objective over 500 kilometers away, will have the result that 200 to 300 kilometer long stretches behind the panzer groups are more or less empty of German troops. That these extensive areas are traversed by panzer troops almost entirely on the road means that everywhere there are still strong enemy elements roaming, and a constant danger exists to the supply and communications of these panzer groups. Okay, what does all that mean? If there's these two armies, and they've separated now, over the course of the Battle of Minsk, these panzer groups have extended themselves out to the east. Now, if they continue on with this objective 500 kilometers away, you're going to see this wide separation. The bulk of the German army is coming as fast as it can, as fast as these men can march, as fast as the horse wagons can drive them. But the panzer groups are going to continue to exploit their advantage. They've got the Soviets seemingly on the run. They've crushed their border armies, and now they want to exploit. So they're driving into the Soviet Union. But to maintain these panzer groups, of course, you need to have supplies. They need to have fuel. They need to have munitions. They're fighting. They're driving. And you have to have these columns of trucks that are driving back and forth to the railheads where the supplies are to bring supplies forward. Now, one of the problems is, in the Battle of Minsk, you have just crushed these border armies. But what does crushed mean? Remember what I said before. This is a very large area, and there are virgin forests there. Many of the Soviet forces in this encirclement, some of them don't even know they've been encircled. There's confusion. They haven't got their communications. They've been knocked out. But the Germans are advancing to do this very quickly, in 10 days, on the roads. They're not going through every field, every forest to sweep through and capture all these Soviet prisoners of war. They're just driving to their objective, encircling it, crushing these armies as large functioning armies. But there's still men all over Belarus who are armed, who are led by lower level commanders, and who go to these roads and see, hey look, there's German columns of trucks moving. Very soft targets, you might imagine. And this is fundamental, because as the German panzer drive onto Smolensk, and indeed do enact an encirclement at Smolensk, they have now got a big problem. And the big problem is how the Soviet system works as a military system. We've got a large number of men that they're trying to mobilize. There are 2.7 million men in the western border districts at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, but there are 5.3 million in the whole of the Soviet Union. So the Soviets are pulling these forces in from all over the Soviet Union, which is to say the first strategic echelon is what the Germans have destroyed in the border battles. But the second strategic echelon is concentrating largely between Smolensk and Moscow. So they're bringing in forces. And the German army is driving, these panzer groups are driving to Smolensk where these forces are formulating. Now, it's not as though these panzer groups can operate exclusively, because there's only 30 of them, panzer divisions and motorized divisions. They can't operate on their own. They do need the infantry. The infantry are the backbone. They provide a tremendous amount of support, especially along a long line. And the Soviet Union is, of course, a very large country, and as you advance further into it, that front expands. The panzer groups are now very much on their own. They're driving deep into the Soviet Union, and they believe they're just exploiting open terrain. They've fought the battles and they've destroyed the Russian army, haven't they, at the borders? But as they advance further into the Soviet Union, these second strategic echelon armies are concentrating there. That means they are going to be caught. As they enact the encirclement, they've got forces inside their encirclement that they want to crush. So they're fighting on these internal lines, but on the exterior, there are Soviet forces that they didn't expect coming from the east that are battering, trying to relieve the pressure on these forces, trying to break into this encirclement. And they're putting these panzer groups under an enormous amount of strain. So there's very, very heavy fighting there at Smolensk, and it's fighting that's taking place largely without the infantry divisions. Now, this is important because as the Battle of Smolensk continues, and it goes on for some weeks, the technical proficiency of these panzer groups is being degraded. And I think this has been one of the problems for historians trying to understand what's happened in Barbarossa. How successful are the Germans? How successful are the Russians? Well, the Russians, losses, astronomical. The Germans, losses, not so great. Not so many men lost. The important point is, though, where are their losses concentrated? If their losses are concentrated in these panzer groups, suddenly that matters, because this is the cutting edge of the German army. To ultimately conquer the Soviet Union, you're going to need these forces. And it may be fine to say, yes, but 80% of the divisions were largely fully intact and fully operational, perhaps a little bit exhausted from marching halfway through the Soviet Union, but they are still there and they're still able to fight. The important point is how many of your tanks are operational. And there's another aspect to this. Part of the problem with understanding how many German resources are available in the panzer groups is how many of them have been destroyed. Now that figure, if you're looking in the war diaries and so on and trying to understand how many tanks have the Germans lost, is actually a very small figure. They haven't lost that much in the first campaign against Minsk, and they're going to lose a lot more in Smolensk, but they're still relatively strong. We're talking in many of the divisions less than 10% of losses. That sounds really good, but here's an interesting statistic. The 7th Panzer Division, which is actually the numerically largest Panzer Division on the Eastern Front, it has 300 tanks in it. In the first in the first week of Operation Barbarossa, has lost 75% of its Mark IV tanks. That's one of the best tanks that Germany produces in 1941, and 50% of its Mark II tanks and Mark III tanks. The Mark III is the other very good tank. They've lost 50% of one type and 75% of the other type. They're not lost because they've been destroyed. Their actual losses are very small, but they've been lost through attrition. Remember, this is largely 1930s technology, and they're driving over extremely poor roads, very bumpy. Belarus has almost no infrastructure, very, very fine sand. What I was noticing in the Panzer diaries is there's a very, very large usage of oil, and I was trying to account for this usage of oil. And what's largely happening is these tanks built for Central European conditions are now fighting in Eastern European summers. Large amounts of motorized vehicles driving down very small roads, kicking up an enormous amount of sand and dust. And this dust, some of the veterans describe driving in a cloud. You couldn't even see the tank in front of you. There is so much of this dust. It's going into the air filters. It overwhelms them within days. And then this dust is going into the engines. And as it goes into the engines, the Germans are aware of this. This is not a good thing. Your cogs and all those things have to be dust and sand free. So they're flushing the engines out with oil. They're using oil 400% of what they're supposed to be using because they're trying to clear their engines. But ultimately what's happening is these tanks are dropping out of service, and they're dropping out in very large rates. The 7th Panzer Division was only the division that actually listed exactly how many they're losing. And so if we're losing 75% in one category of tank, 50% in another category of tank, you can see that actually the attrition of German motorized vehicles is very, very high in the early stages of Barbarossa. Now, they have got spare parts. They can restore these vehicles very, very quickly. But over the weeks of Barbarossa, the overall motorization of this Ostheer, and particularly these panzer groups, is in decline, and it's in rapid decline. And the ultimate story of Operation Barbarossa, and one of its main failings, is not what we typically think, how many tanks were destroyed at the battlefront, but rather what was the cost of these great victories. Minsk is a victory, Smolensk will ultimately be a victory, another 300,000 Soviet prisoners of war taken, and by all those classic military indicators, the German army is advancing a great deal of distance. They've gotten to Smolensk, that's 2/3 of the way to Moscow. Within the opening month of the campaign, they have captured a large number of Soviet prisoners of war, but what's very important is the Eastern Front still very much exists, that second strategic echelon of Soviet forces, and there is a third forming up behind that. They are still very much there. The German army has, I don't want to say it's shot its bolt, it certainly has a lot more offensive capabilities left in it, but it has lost a very large number of its operational tanks. To give you a figure on that, Panzer Group 3, Panzer Group 2, that's the two that are assigned to Army Group Center, have by early August, the first week in August, lost 50% of their tank army. And the problem is, by this point, they've used up their spare engines and a lot of their spare parts. You don't have to carry these things if you're in the German Ostheer, the German Wehrmacht, because we win campaigns in one brief, sharp engagement, and then, how does it work? They transport the tanks quite literally back to the German factories to be reconditioned, to be refurbished. They don't carry with them large numbers of spare engines because the tank won't outlast the life of the engine, so they don't have spare engines. Guderian and Hort, that's the two Panzer Group commanders, they're besieging Bock, the commander of Army Group Center, saying, we desperately need new engines. The tanks are there. They're functional. They just don't work anymore because there's too much sand in those engines, or the engines have just been blown out because they're operating almost 24/7, and we need to replace them. But the ultimate fact is the German war industry doesn't produce more engines than it produces tanks. There's never been a plan for this idea that you might lose 50% of your engines without losing the actual tanks themselves. So there's not the resources there, and in any case, Hitler is not releasing any more tanks for the Eastern Front. He believes this campaign will still be won. It's going to be over in the next few weeks, and I want to keep whatever new production we have for the next campaign, which he's planning for a drive into the Middle East and so on. So he's not releasing anything. And those panzer commanders are there in central Russia now, and they only have 50% of their strength. As Helder, the commander-in-chief of the German General Staff, says, we've one more campaign left in us. We've one more great operation that we can launch before we're going to get to this autumn period. And that's another part of the campaign that I'll talk about in a minute. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is the infantry. Remember I said that there's these two armies. We can see that there's a large number of attrition, a heavy rate of attrition in the panzer groups. Well, there's also strain for the infantry divisions. And to give you a statistic on this, in July 1941, this is of course the fantastic era of German blitzkrieg and successes, German losses on the Eastern Front, dead, not just losses, dead, comes to 63,000 men. Now, 63,000 men, to many of you may just feel like, well, how many is that? I have no idea. Well, if I gave you the figure, in all the years that the United States fights in Vietnam, in all those years, from advisors under Eisenhower right through to the fall of Saigon, the number of American casualties in Vietnam is 58,000 something. 58,000 in all the years of Vietnam. Well, 1 month on the Eastern Front, that figure is exceeded by 5,000 for the German Wehrmacht. I think that's important because it again underlines the intensity and the scale of this war. Yes, the German army in its successful phase is taking a great deal of territory and is achieving these amazing statistics, but it's at a cost. It's at a radical cost. And if they cannot end this war, then the implications are dire. And the strains on the march for these infantrymen, they are having to march. If you look on a world map, you can already see where the Barbarossa campaign has gotten in the first 6 weeks. And infantry divisions, so the large bulk of this this Ostheer are quite literally marching from the German-Soviet border to Smolensk, and they're having to do it under pressure of, we have some of the war diaries there too, 45 kilometers a day. I should have actually converted some of this to miles. I know you guys work in miles. It's a very, very long distance, put it that way, especially when you've got a helmet, a backpack, a rifle, and you're doing this in the middle of the summer. And some of the letters, because I look at a lot of the German soldiers' war diaries, the soldiers, not just the command functions, they talk about the letters and the diaries. In the most extreme instances, one platoon commander said, my men collapsed at the end of the day, exhausted. 3 of them had to be given medical attention, and 1 of them the next morning had died. Young men literally dying on the march. Another one talked about the fact that at the end of the day's march, after we have been marching and marching and marching days on end, sometimes you hear talk of suicide as a possible escape. I mean, I don't want to say that's every German soldier, but it certainly underlines just how ruthless this advance into the Soviet Union was, and indeed how costly it was, even without fighting. Okay, now I did also talk to George, and we were talking about how best to represent Barbarossa, and one of the ideas we had was to give you all a map. And I understand you've been handed that before you came in, and maybe if I just talk to that map, I think that the first thing a lot of you might notice in looking at that is how confusing really Barbarossa looks. This is a map from the central part of Russia, and it's obviously the 22nd of June. Now, in the very middle, you can see a big black dot, and that's Smolensk. And that's what, again, I said at the beginning about, city names give their names to much larger operations. Well, this is a very large area of Russia. And you can see all of those numbers represent divisions. Now, if you imagine a division is 15,000 men, you're looking right there at, in military terms, or military representation, we're looking at a very large number of men. We're talking in excess of 1 million men, especially if you take both sides to this campaign. You can also see that some of the divisions are coming up, if you look on the left-hand side, they're coming up. These are the infantry divisions. They are coming up to relieve the panzer divisions, which you can see are more concentrated on the right-hand side. The Germans, of course, are the blue, the red are the Soviets. And the other thing there is I've put in a box the Soviet army. So at the very bottom you can maybe see there the 4th Army. It just says 4A and then 13A and then 28A, and you can see them as you go up through the page. These are Soviet armies. Now that in itself is important because we are, from the German point of view, if you study their plans, they believe that after Smolensk and Minsk we have crushed the Russian army. There can't be anything left of it. We have enacted these encirclements, we've crushed their forces, and now it's just a process of advancing into the Soviet Union unopposed. But clearly, at this point in the war, even after they've almost cut off that encirclement there, and that's where you can see that bulge around Smolensk, even after they've cut that off, there is still very much in evidence a Russian front, and a Russian front, or a Soviet front I should say, manned by large numbers of forces. And keep in mind, there is a 3rd strategic echelon mobilizing around Moscow and further to the east. And indeed, there is a whole program of Russian mobilization that is taking place. The Wehrmacht have bitten off very much more than they can chew. Already in this successful phase of the campaign, they've lost 50% of their single most important element, these panzer groups, and they haven't managed to end Soviet resistance. Indeed, the Soviets are gathering strength in spite of their heavy losses. And all of this speaks to the scale of this war, as well as the confusion of it, I can assure you. Now, another aspect to understanding Barbarossa's failure or success comes back to another point I mentioned at the beginning, logistics. How do you sustain this enormous army in the east, especially when this army is now a very, very long way, and all those infantry divisions are a very, very long way to the east, and they've all got to be supplied, okay? Well, the important thing here is to understand how that is supposed to work. The German logistics in the east operate on 2 major principles. First of all, trucks. Trucks drive resources to the front. And at the very beginning, that's what sustains these panzer groups. They have their fuel dumps and their supply dumps, and they're being supplied by their own trucks. They're driving back and forth. But imagine this. The further you drive into the Soviet Union, the longer the distances those trucks have to drive. So the greater the interval between supplies. Initially, it's very short. They can make that distance quickly. But as you drive further and further and further into the east, you have to drive a lot further with that truck to get back to your supplies, and you have to drive all the way back again. And of course, the longer the distance, the truck has to consume its own supplies of fuel and etc. in order to simply get back to the front lines. So the solution is the railroads. The railroads are going to have to be fundamental to sustaining operations, especially if you're going to try and sustain operations as far east as Smolensk. One of the things that many of you may not know is that the Soviet gauge was much broader than the rest of Europe. That makes sense because, of course, Soviet distances, this is a vast country, biggest country in the world, they have to build larger locomotives so that it's more efficient. In Central Europe, though, you don't need such large locomotives, so you build smaller systems, narrower gauges. Well, this is not going to be a problem for the German Wehrmacht. They believe if we get into the east, we're going to need train lines. We can't afford to build them. That won't be consistent with blitzkrieg. So all you have to do is knock the pins up from these rails, push them closer together, knock the pins back down again, and a train will operate, a German train will operate on those lines. It seems like a very simple idea, and the railroad troops, as they're called, they are an aspect of this Eastern Army. They will drive east, and they will conduct this rail conversion very rapidly in order to extend the rail lines further to the east so they can bring up supplies and the trucks can keep efficiently supplying these panzer groups. Well, there's a big problem with this. And the problem is that the Soviets are fighting really from the 22nd of June 1941, from the first day of the war. They are fighting a total war. And total war means if we can't keep something, we're going to destroy it. They are very good at destroying their rail lines, at destroying infrastructure all over the western parts of the Soviet Union as the Germans are coming. It's not complete. Sometimes they do capture rail lines intact, but large parts of this infrastructure are destroyed, and the Germans aren't prepared for this. This is not consistent with blitzkrieg. You can't rebuild an entire rail line in a matter of days when you have to bring up all these resources, and that's, again, the problem. We haven't got enough capacity to supply the armies in the east, and now we have to bring up sleepers, we have to bring up rails, we have to bring up everything, all of this heavy industry. Another big problem with this idea is, if you accept the idea that the Soviet locomotives and everything are much larger, that's indisputable, then they can travel a much larger distance than the German trains. So between roughly each of the Soviet service stations, even if they're captured intact, the Germans ultimately have to build another set of slidings and turnstiles and water towers and coal, all this infrastructure that manages trains. They have to build another one from scratch between roughly the other the already established Soviet service stations. And so there's a whole lot of heavy construction that needs to take place that the Germans aren't really planning for. Keep in mind, they believe this war is going to be won at the border. They're going to drive into the Soviet Union, encircle those forces, and then the rest is from the 1918 example, that is after the Russians have been defeated in the First World War, they conduct a railroad advance, they call it. They simply get on the Russian railroads in 1918 and they ride the Russian railroads to the next town, get out of the train and declare this town is captured. It was as simple as that, and they have a lot of very optimistic ideas about how the Barbarossa campaign will proceed after they have crushed, as they see it, the border armies. Well, this is not the case, and now they need to supply a very, very large army a long way into the Soviet Union with terrible infrastructure. The roads are bad, they're having the same effect on the trucks as they had on the tanks. The infrastructure for the trains has been destroyed, and they need now to rebuild this. This is taking a very, very long time, and because there's so much pressure to do this, they're building the infrastructure as quickly as they can to a very poor quality standard. That means that when the trains are ultimately running on this, they're traveling at 15 kilometers an hour. Extremely slow, because they simply can't travel any faster. They haven't really been, the lines haven't been built properly. So there's an enormous amount of problems keeping this Eastern Army supplied, giving it the fuel and the munitions it needs. And remember, the war isn't over. It's still a high-intensity war. They need to get munitions up to the front. There's a whole second strategic echelon of Soviet forces that are now fighting Army Group Center. There's major battles raging in the south in the Ukraine and up toward Leningrad, where Army Group North is driving. So there's a real pressure on the German system to keep supplies moving east, and there simply isn't an ability for them to sustain that. One of the other areas you might have wondered about is what exactly are the German soldiers eating? Well, the idea for sustaining the Eastern Army is that they will simply live off the land, so to speak, and that means that they are expropriating everything they need from Soviet peasants. Now, these weren't very fertile areas, especially in the north. The Ukraine was very fertile, but in the north, and where Army Group Center was, Belarus and these central parts of Russia, they're not particularly fertile. The people there are dirt poor, and the German army is now sweeping over this, as one veteran described it, like locusts, taking everything they can from these people. And it becomes another aspect of this Vernichtungskrieg, it's the war of annihilation. The fact that the people there, not initially, but certainly by the autumn and the winter, they are themselves starving. And a good deal of research in German has been done on that. But this is how they're trying to solve that logistic problem for the German army, that they will literally take it from the Soviet people. So how do we understand the summer of 1941 as a victory for the German Wehrmacht? Well, again, if you'll indulge me, just a few statistics on this. As I said, there are 5.3 million Soviet men in the Red Army on the 22nd of June, 2.7 million concentrated in the east, but they're coming together. Well, the real secret of Soviet strength is their mobilization base. That is to say, not men who are in the Red Army, but men who in past generations have received military training. The Soviet Union was a very militarized state, much as the Nazi state was, and there are 14 million men who are able to be mobilized and who have had military training. And of course, with this total war being declared from the very beginning, there is a very, very heavy concentration of reserves into the muster stations. By the end of June 1941, 5.3 million men have been raised through the Soviet mobilization system, and that allows for, in July 1941, 13 new armies. You're looking at all these new armies on the paper there on the map. They're coming from this. In August, they will raise 14 more armies. And what does this all mean? German army, keep in mind, have to defeat the Soviet Union. That is the only plan they have for 1941. There is no contingency for not doing this. The German Wehrmacht must do this. We've concentrated everything in the east. Everything rests on this. Economically, we simply can't afford anything else. And yet the Soviets are raising new armies that, in a statistical sense, on the 22nd of June represents the Red Army as 5.3 million men. But hear this. On the 31st of August, the Red Army now numbers 6,889,000 men. So the Red Army, in spite of its heavy losses throughout the Eastern Front, is actually growing in size. And by December 1941, so at the end of this Barbarossa campaign, having lost 3.3 million men as prisoners of war and millions more killed and wounded, untold millions, the Red Army, according to David Glantz, who is the single greatest authority on the Soviet army in the Second World War, suggests the figure is around about 8 million. Now that says an enormous amount about the failure of Barbarossa if this Red Army can't be destroyed. And of course, we shouldn't understand those figures as being that one man equals one man. The Red Army on the 22nd of June was a far better army than it was towards the end of the year. Large numbers of very good and irreplaceable officers have been killed. The Red Army at the end of the year is nowhere near as proficient as it was at the beginning of the war, but neither is the German Wehrmacht. If we don't have time to go through all the campaigns, but I've taken you up as far as Smolensk. After Smolensk is another great battle in the south, the Battle of Kiev. After that, Army Group Center will continue its drive toward Moscow at the Battle of Vyazma and Bryansk. They will drive on to Moscow, and all the while, the German panzer divisions are being downgraded again and again. And I've just written a book on November 1941. This is the one that's under review right now. We have panzer divisions there in the early part of November, driving on Moscow with all of 7 tanks in them. They are by no means divisions. They're just divisions in names. And many of them are like this. And even if they've got 30, 40 tanks, a lot of them are reconstructed tanks. So they've basically been built out of cannibalized other tanks simply to put them in the field. But their ability to traverse any great distances is very limited, beyond their fighting capacity. And the other thing that has to be understood is the Red Army actually, in 1941, has a lot of new weaponry. They have George was 100% correct. Large numbers of their 20,000 tanks are rubbishy tanks. The Soviet Army doesn't throw away military equipment, they keep it. But what's coming online in 1941 is fundamental to survival of the Red Army. For example, the T-34, the most famous Soviet tank of the war. This is one of the historians I was speaking to in Germany described it to me as a wonder weapon. And it really is for its time. When you understand how a tank has to operate, of course, the more army you put on it, on the one hand, that sounds better, but it loses mobility. It was really a tank of perfect proportions. It could drive faster than any of the German tanks at that time. It had very wide tracks, so it wouldn't get caught in the snow and ice, and it could, as I say, go overland much faster. It had armor that made it strong enough to defend against any of the German tank guns from a certain range, and its own gun could penetrate any German armor. So it was a really very good tank, and it was cheap to produce. The German tanks were built in factories which turned out less, but turned out very good tanks that could serve many different roles. I mean, some of the German tanks, believe it or not, could actually drive through rivers. They had a snorkel, so they could actually drive through a river, which is a wonderful thing to give you flexibility in your military operations. But what you need on the Eastern Front is raw material. You need vast amounts of it because this war consumes material at a tremendous rate. And the Soviets could do this. These tanks were very, very simple to put together. They were being put together by women and children by the end of 1941, as well as whatever men wouldn't be sent to the Eastern Front, to the Western Front, the Soviet Western Front. But that's important. You have to be able to produce small numbers of weapons in the Soviet system that are extremely cheap to produce in terms of material and very easy to assemble. And that's exactly what they have. And some of the statistics that really underline just how that war is going to go once Germany's ability to end it in 1941. These statistics, I think, really tell the story of the war in the East. German aircraft in 1941, how many aircraft does the German war industry turn out? They turn out 11,700 aircraft. Keeping in mind, Germany isn't exclusively fighting in the East. They have a war in the Mediterranean, in the North African campaign, of course in defending German skies against British bombers, and their figure is 11,700. Soviet figures for 1941, taking into account that they are losing a large amount of their territory, they have produced 15,700 aircraft. Now, I'm not saying a Messerschmitt is the same as a Yak, okay? We can't make this quite so simple, but it's clear that the Soviet war industry is continuing to function, even in its year of greatest crisis. And if we look ahead, the next year, German industry is, of course, mobilizing. Speer is now in control as of 1942, and German industry is going to produce a great deal more. But they're only producing in 1942 15,400 planes, as opposed to Soviet production, 25,400. This is telling you the story. Once Blitzkrieg is no longer the German strategy and it is a war of attrition, it matters how much can you produce. This is a resource-intensive war. I think it was Marshall, the American General Marshall, who said this is a war as much of tanks as it is of chimneys. And I think this is very true, especially on the Eastern Front. In tank production, 1941, the Germans produced 5,200 tanks. That same year, the Soviets produced 9,200 tanks. Okay, they're losing them faster, but they are continuing to produce them. And in the next year, Germany will produce slightly more, 6,600 tanks. The Soviets will produce 24,000 tanks. And these tanks are not T-26s, the old variety. These tanks are not exclusively, but largely KV-1s, T-34s. And these are very, very good tanks for the Soviet Union. And an indication of just how this war is going is apparent to the German General Staff. If you'll let me read out one quotation from Helder's private diary. In early August 1941, he writes this: "At the start of the war, we reckoned with 200 enemy divisions. Now we count 360. These divisions are not armed and equipped in our sense, and tactically they are inadequate in many ways. But there they are. And if we destroy a dozen of them, the Russians simply put up another dozen in their place. The time factor favors them, as they are near to their own centers of power, while we are moving constantly away from ours. And so our troops, sprawled over an immense front, without any depth, are subject to incessant attacks of the enemy. These are not always successful, but with these enormous gaps, what can we do?" And I think this speaks a tremendous amount about the problem, the strategic problem, that the German Ostheer, the German Eastern Army, faces. They have begun a war that they can't end, and materially this poses grave or holds grave implications for how Germany's war will continue. It's not to suggest that the road to Berlin and the conquest of Berlin is somehow evident in 1941, but the seeds of that failure of the German army are very much present in 1941. And there is still an enormous amount of fighting to come. Of course, the Soviets have to learn how to fight this kind of technical warfare, and the Germans in the period after 1941 will become equally proficient in defensive warfare as they have been in offensive warfare. But it's clear that if Germany cannot win this war, if they can't end it, if they can't stop Soviet power, what's going to happen is not just is the Soviet Union gathering more material and manpower. By the end of the war, they will have 12 million men in the Red Army. But of course, the British, now backed by Lend-Lease aid from the United States, are gathering strength all the time, and the continental blockade is biting. Over the course of the war, Germany will become more and more impoverished, and their need for raw materials will become greater, and they simply cannot replace this through Romanian oil. That's nowhere near enough production. Raw materials, they don't have enough food to survive, but when they dominate Europe, and they're Nazis with the Nazi ideology, it's not Germans who are going to starve, it'll be others who starve. And they will starve in Greece and in parts of the East. So this system, the Nazi system, radicalizes over the course of the war in order to try and sustain this war effort. But it's a forlorn effort the further you go into the war. If I look at my clock, I see that I've taken up enough of your time. The only other thing I want to reiterate just at the end is we've talked a lot about the material factors of Operation Barbarossa. So how is this war being fought? How does it progress? There is another element to this, which is a conflict between Hitler and his German general staff over strategy, which is only to make the point that should they drive toward Moscow, should they drive into the Ukraine, the German command is not unified in the summer of 1941. They are as much fighting the Red Army as they are fighting each other. And this poses a whole set of other problems. Obviously, for a great campaign like Barbarossa, you want to have some sort of strategic clarity. You want to have a sense that we've planned this out. But actually, the war in the East is being improvised on a day-to-day basis, and lower-level commanders aren't exactly sure where they're supposed to go next, so they're not exactly sure how they're supposed to behave in any given situation, or whether they should be preparing to attack more to this way or this way. It's a confusing period for the German command, and it's largely because of a disagreement between the German general staff and Hitler, which will ultimately be resolved, as many disputes are in the Second World War, to Hitler's favor. And this will be why the German armies don't attack directly toward Moscow from Smolensk, but instead drive into the Ukraine, and only later in October with Operation Typhoon attempt to try and seize Moscow. On that note, I just want to say thank you very, very much for listening to me. This is, of course, my area of research. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about something that I'm so passionate about and have had the opportunity to work in such detail on. I hope you've been able to learn something, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions you may have.
Okay, at this time we're going to take questions for Dr. Stayhill.
Dr. Stayhill, I have a question for you, in fact, a commentary a little bit. On the Russian T-34, I think if you look at that in their new design, when they started to put the armor plating on there, it was at an angle so that it would deflect German rounds. But I know you didn't get this far into your discussion, but can you elaborate a little bit on how the winter affected the Barbarossa, and what were if you have the German statistics on the losses that they suffered just because of the natural temperatures and everything? And my understanding is that 1941 was probably one of the toughest winters they ever had, and the German army not being equipped to handle that.
Well, I think one of the things you need to understand about this winter campaign is from the 22nd of June until the 5th of December 1941, the German armies are on the offensive. And of course, they're driving into the east. They come as far as the gates of Moscow by this December 5th, 1941, when Army Group Center call off this offensive. They simply realize that they haven't encircled Moscow yet, and that driving into a city like Moscow, this is a major center, and this city has been under threat now for months. So they have been mobilizing within Moscow street barricades. They have turned building corners into machine gun nests. This city is fortified in a way I think few cities in history have been fortified. In fact, one of the historians referred to it as a super Madrid. If you have a sense of the Spanish Civil War and the long period at which Madrid was the focus of fighting, Moscow by 1941, or the end of 1941, was a super Madrid. And the German armies at this point were exhausted. We're talking infantry divisions that have suffered in terms of their combat formations. They are down to 20 men in a company, and a company should have about 150. So the idea of getting into high-intensity urban warfare, this is the most expensive kind of warfare you can have. You probably have heard of stories of Stalingrad and how the 6th Army, trudged through with hundreds of men to take a street corner. Because urban warfare really does suit the Red Army. If you're a less proficient and less trained army, urban environments are probably the best place to fight, because it's not as though well-trained forces on an open field who can maneuver and are well-trained will destroy an army far faster than they will in close quarters, when every other building can place soldiers behind it, and you don't need much technical proficiency. You need luck, and you need vast amounts of military resources. That's urban warfare, and the Soviets, of course, are going to be better placed for this. But German forces don't even actually make it to Moscow. They are in a small part of the front. You might say they are at the outskirts of Moscow. There's a famous memoir called Moscow Tram Stop, which gives people the idea that the whole German army was somehow at the gates of Moscow. Large parts were on the exterior. Remember, this is a very, very large front, and only one part have they reached Moscow. The German losses, aggregate losses, for the whole of the German Ostheer, we're talking about 750,000 men. And this is the successful phase of the German army. An army cannot lose 20% of its forces and still continue on through a Russian winter on the offensive. They had realized that there's no further opportunity here for them to seize, to encircle and capture a great city like Moscow, and so they call it off. What Army Group Center don't realize is they believe, the commanders, every commander in Army Group Center, as well as in Hitler's high command, they believe categorically, after all the damage we have dealt the Red Army this year, and they are just straining to hold us back, there's no way they could possibly have more reserves for an entire major winter offensive. I've just come out of the German archive. I was there the last 3 weeks, and I've been checking the last files for the book that's just been finished. And it is clear, on the 3rd of December, Fremde Heer Ost, that's the German intelligence organization that gathers information on the Soviet and Red Army forces, they categorically state there's no chance of them launching a major operational offensive against us. So on the 6th of December, when Zhukov, the Soviet commander of the Western Front, that's the front, they use front instead of army group, that's the Soviet front defending Moscow, when they begin their offensive against Army Group Center, this is wholly unexpected. They simply don't believe that the Soviets could do this, and they have burned the German army out. They have thrown everything into this offensive against Moscow because they believed if only we could just take Moscow, then that would perhaps be the end of the war. Remember, when Paris fell, the rest of France just seemed to collapse. No one else had much stomach for the fight. And Helder, particularly, the chief of the German General Staff, believes if we take Moscow, the same thing could happen. So they've expended everything throughout October and November to try and get Moscow. It's not worked. They realize they've been defeated. But that's okay. We'll finish the job in 1942. And then they are hit by the Western Front and the Kalinin Front, that's the front further to the north, as well as fronts further south. There will be a Soviet offensive throughout the areas of Army Group Center, and this will lead to disasters. Units that are sometimes encircled, some of them will break out, some of them won't, smaller units, and we will look at a very large number, or again, this idea of attrition in the Eastern Campaign will continue through the winter. And what's left in 1942 is a shadow of the army that existed in June June 1941. And that's why people look at 1942 and they say, yes, but the whole Stalingrad campaign, Germany was very powerful. Keep in mind, Army Group North is not moving. Army Group Center is not moving. It's only one army group. If Germany gathers all its forces together to rebuild panzer groups and panzer divisions and drives on towards Stalingrad, yes, they're driving into the east, but they're not able to drive on the whole front anymore, and indeed Army Group Center, in the summer of 1942, is straining against heavy Soviet attacks. The Eastern Front is in many ways an unwritten area. I often say to PhD students, if you're looking for an area to study in World War II, people, Anglo-Americans, all of us with English, are looking often at topics where we fought. And the difficulty in academia is you need to have new historiography, you have to have new ideas, that's what publishers want. And that makes sense, because that's interesting new areas, but what you end up with in the Anglo-American experience is very niche areas, very small people, very small topics. So I'll research tank diaries on the North African campaign and how that affected morale in June of 1942. That's a great topic perhaps for a PhD, but wouldn't it be great to write a book where you can talk about a macro area with dramatic implications that no one's ever written on before, that involves hundreds of thousands of men, and frankly, we don't have books on this. You might be interested to hear, Germans don't really do military history. You might think there's this whole vast literature out there because that's their area of history. Actually, Germans don't really write this stuff. There's been a taboo since the Second World War of doing operational military history. It's not to be confused with Germans are somehow trying to sweep under the rug their losses or anything. The Germans do an enormous amount of research. In fact, they lead the field in research into the Vernichtungskrieg, this war of annihilation, what the German army did, all the horrors and the terrors of the campaigns in the East, as well as the Holocaust. That's what German historians do. That's what universities are concerned with. And me going to Germany was actually, I was a bit of a pariah when I would say I'm doing German operations on the Eastern Front. That struck them as being, why would anyone do this? And even for people my generation, that still was a surprising topic, because to them, that's not really what you do in World War II. That's perhaps what Americans do with American history and what Americans did in World War II, but it's not what Germans do. I think that's a carryover from the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 1970s, this sense that in Germany, if we study what we would call operational history, military history, is that not learning the lessons or trying to learn the lessons so that another war can be fought better? There's a distinct pacifist ethic that pervades the intelligentsia, you might say, the educated circles, especially in history, in Germany. It's not to say, again, that they're trying to sweep this under the rug, but but this military history isn't done. So there's vast topics out there that we just simply haven't researched. I know that's a bit of a tangent from your question, but it does underline, again, how much of this war in the East there is and how much of it has been researched. And I can honestly say that the latter part of the winter, I'm just looking at that for a new book, so February, March, April, the latter parts of these battles, there's very, very little on it, even in English. December and January is when people have largely written their books. So there's an enormous amount to do here, and all I can say is if one spent their entire career on here, you can only really scratch the surface. I mean, we see how many books come out every year on things like D-Day, and yet ever new books come out with good presses suggesting there's a lot more to be done. But the Eastern Front, with millions of men, it's virgin territory.
That's why he's David Stahel, and he's probably the premier historian in his area. That's the enthusiasm. Other questions? Obviously, students?
Hi. You said that Hitler decided to not invade Moscow and instead to protect the Ukraine, invade the Ukraine. Oh God. So could you give me the reasoning for that, why he decided on that, and if he actually had gone ahead with the original Barbarossa and invaded Moscow when he could have, how would that actually have affected the outcome of the Soviet Union invasion?
Okay, it's a good question. The rationale or the debate, and I'll have to do this in a shorter term because, of course, this has a long prehistory. From 1940 already, the German General Staff are convinced Moscow is the solution to the defeat of the Soviet Union, and Helder and Brauchitsch, that's the commander-in-chief of the German army, but Helder really runs the show in the OKH, the High Command of the German army. These two guys are pushing for Moscow. Hitler is against it, and Hitler states that already then. Now, these two guys cannot directly challenge Hitler, not just because he's Hitler, but because the prehistory to that is Helder and Brauchitsch didn't submit very good plans for the attack against France, and Hitler was never in favor of their plans. In fact, he kept dismissing them. And ultimately, Manstein will come up with a plan that Hitler will agree with, and he will enact this plan, but it leaves Hitler with this sense that Helder and Brauchitsch are good, perhaps functionally, they run my army, but I don't need them for strategic planning. And I think that they also know this because they never directly contradict Hitler when he's talking about driving into the Soviet Union, crushing the Red Army in the center, and then we divert these panzer groups, Panzer Group 3, Panzer Group 2, one to the north toward Leningrad and one to the south towards the Ukraine. They never contradict him on this. They never challenge him. They want harmony. And they believe this will be a successful campaign. We're not invading the Soviet Union to lose. Of course, the German Wehrmacht that's crushed France and the rest of Europe will be successful. So why do we have to risk political capital by challenging Hitler and his plans when more than likely in the opening weeks this will be over, and then we can take everything, the Ukraine, Leningrad and Moscow all at the same time. But the problem is, 1 month into the campaign, it seems on the surface to have been going very well, but they're also clear that there are Soviet forces further to the east. We have to destroy these forces. We have to get to Moscow. And that's when Helder finally has to stand up and say, no, we need to go toward Moscow and not drive into the Ukraine. And this becomes then a head-on clash with Hitler. It's a very, very intense clash because Helder is, first of all, the chief of the German General Staff, but he has a lot of backers. Brauchitsch is backing him. Bock, the commander of Army Group Center, the two panzer commanders, Guderian and Hort, back him. And this is a bit of a difference. When you understand the politics of how this whole system operates, Helder has no political capital because he's not a real general in Hitler's eyes. A real general is a man out on the field who fights. He will be much more prepared to listen to someone like Guderian or Hort than he would be to listen to Helder. And so Helder presents all of these men and presents this weight of opinion. Hitler flies out to Army Group Center in early August and meets with these men. All of them are telling him the same thing. Moscow is the answer. We must go to Moscow. Helder talks to Rundstedt, the commander of Army Group South, has him even say, even though he would love to have forces drive into the central part of the Ukraine and help him encircle Kiev, he will say to Hitler, no, you should go to Moscow. Helder is mustering support wherever he can. He can even get Jodl, who is a part of the OKW. Okay, to try and understand this, Hitler's High Command, OKW, that's his inner circle. And then there's the High Command of the German Army, the OKH, that's where Helder and all these other generals are. So the army is backing Helder, and even a man in Hitler's inner circle, the chief of operations, Jodl, for the Wehrmacht command, that's the command that Hitler deals with every day, even one of them agrees with Helder, I will supply him with information that supports the idea that we go to Moscow. So Hitler is under pressure from all the generals to select this option, and it's a very intense debate, and it will go on for the next month. It begins around the third week of July, and it will continue on until finally Hitler makes his decision a month later. Now, often you'll discover in the secondary literature that people will say, oh, they waited a whole month in the summer of 1941 before ultimately making this decision, and what a disaster that was. That's not the case. They are not sitting around waiting, trying to make a decision. In the meantime, the Battle of Smolensk is ending, and then in August, yes, Army Group Center is not attacking, well, it's doing a little bit of attacking in the south, but largely the operations are at a standstill. That's because of what I said before. The Panzer Group commanders are saying, we can't drive on. We've lost 50% of our tanks. We've lost large numbers of our motorization. And so the idea is we'll wait 2 weeks to rest and refit, put as many of these tanks back into operation as we possibly can, while we expedite with the Luftwaffe as many spare parts to the east as we possibly can, and then we can conduct the next stage of operations wherever they're going to go, Moscow or down to the south. And it's only towards the end or the third week of August that Hitler finally just decides we are going to do this. And the reasons for that, beyond Hitler's own, he doesn't want to be told what to do. But I think that the answer is he's aware of something I've been talking about. He's aware this war is not as quickly over as I think it will be. And if this war is going to go on, we need to have economic resources to sustain it. Where are those economic resources? They're in the south. We need the Don Basin. That's the eastern parts of the Ukraine. There's large numbers of mines there with coal and everything else. We need the Ukraine for the grain. We need the Caucasus for the oil. We need these resources, and if we're not going to be able to take the whole of the Soviet Union in 1941, which I think he's already aware of to some extent, then we want to go down there. And ultimately, there's a tremendous prize in the Soviet Southwestern Front. That's the 5 armies defending Kiev. They are exposed to the north. They are defending against Army Group South. I know you can't picture all this in your heads, but don't worry. If we did turn that 2nd Panzer Group south, they would push against an open door, basically, and they would drive into the rear of the Soviet Southwestern Front, and that could be a catastrophe for the Soviets, and indeed it was. The Battle of Kiev results in about 1 million men being wiped off the Soviet order of battle. So it's a phenomenally successful campaign. Not that I think Hitler is as focused on that. He's more focused on the economic resources.
All right, David, another question.
I've read on several occasions about German strategy and German tactics where you're using the Air Force as a tactical asset. There's some schools of thought, especially in the military, that if the Soviets would have had a long-range bomber for doing interdiction missions against key points for bringing troops up, like Moscow, if they could have knocked out I think it's between 25 and 30 major rail yards in the Moscow area, they could have stopped reinforcements that were coming in for Typhoon and some of the other operations. And it's a failure of strategy. Some of the stuff you talk about has changed a lot of what I know about Barbarossa, so I'm curious what you have to say about that.
I think it's a good question. People often just talk about this. The Soviets don't have a long-range bomber. You're absolutely right. But there is good reason for this. The Soviet system is as successful as it is because, as I said before, they limit the number of production programs, weapon programs that they're committing themselves to. And a long-range bomber in a war that is predominantly a land war doesn't really make much sense. Strategic bombers give you other options, but keep in mind, first of all, in the Soviet instance, the British are the ones with the bomber force. The British, who can promise nothing else, they're desperate to help their Soviet ally, but what can they offer? We're fighting 40,000 German soldiers in North Africa. That doesn't sound particularly good when Stalin is talking to Churchill and saying, yeah, well, we're dealing with millions of German soldiers. So the only thing Churchill can offer is he says, don't worry, we will bomb them. We will bomb them relentlessly. We have got the new Sterling bomber coming online, etc., etc. We're going to bomb them. So it doesn't make sense for the Soviets to invest in a bomber program, especially since what they are desperately needing are 3 things. Ground attack aircraft, that's the kind of aircraft they're building. Fighters and ground attack aircraft, and they're very useful in that sense. Tanks and artillery. These are the implements of war. And if you build these, you can churn them out in large numbers. A strategic bomber, 4 engines, and the Soviets don't have a history of building these. And as we know from many of the national weapons programs, there's an evolutionary process. It takes time. You build one and you realize, oh, this hasn't quite got all the specs we need. It doesn't do this, it doesn't do that. We build another one. This is resource intensive to do this. And it's simply not feasible for the Soviets to do this. But it also doesn't serve a purpose. Strategic bombing, even if you look at the British, it's not till really the end of the war that they're having major effects on the German war industry. And so the idea that the Soviets should invest resources in this doesn't really make sense. And they never go for it. They never really try it. It's not until the Cold War that the Soviets try, and even then have a great deal of difficulty building a strategic air bomber.
Hi, thank you, Professor Stayhill. I appreciate having the last question here. In this class, as Introduction to World War II, we've selected John Keegan's book, and a British author, of course. Do you have any comments about this book for students on an introductory basis, what you feel that this book provides students by author John Keegan?
Sure, I've got my copy behind me. Look, I think what you need for students is accessibility. That's the one thing I realize. I mean, I think it's a problem for academics sometimes. You end up reading so many books, you end up going through all of this stuff, and you see all this detail because that's where you're working. But I think what we have to remember is everyday people don't necessarily, I'm sure some of you do, because you've all volunteered your Monday evening to come along and listen to this, and so you're probably better informed than your average Joe. But if you've got students who are coming in, and I'm realizing that even here, and I teach at the Australian Defence Force Academy, we have people who've grown up with an interest in World War II, but sometimes you realize they've come and they have erroneous ideas of how the world works, or they don't quite know where various countries are and so on. And in that sense, you need a very basic book that explains the broad brushstroke war in an accessible way. And I think John Keegan certainly does that. I mean, there are other books that I like on the subject of World War II, if I had to recommend one. it depends on how big you want the book to be. Of course, if you look at Weinberg's A World at Arms, that's probably twice the size, and I know that in itself turns students off. So Keegan's is probably, you might say, the right size, and it does canvass the war in a generally accurate way. There's one or two statistics in there I recall where I thought, oh, that's not right. But I think every academic, if you ask them, always has their particular version of events. So yeah, look, I think it's fine.
David, you just put the students under the chairs here. They're a little worried that that's the next book. All right, could we thank Dr. Stayhill for his presentation this evening? Very informative. Thank you very much. Gave us all a different perspective on the Eastern Front and Barbarossa. And please, he's written 3 books, 4th to be released sometime early in the summer. Is that right, David?
Well, actually, everyone always thinks that when you write the book, it will be out very soon, but Cambridge have a very long production period because we have to make maps and get the rights to photos, and it has to be copy edited, and it's at the last stage now with the syndicate, that's the Cambridge University College. So it'll be about a year, I would say, before it'll be actually physically available, but it'll be advertised in, I'd say, about 6 months, as soon as it gets an ISBN number. All
right, early 15. Thank you again. And enjoy your warm weather. 97 degrees there today, huh?
I wasn't going to mention that. I don't want to rub it in, but yeah, it is a beautiful day today.
You can turn your webcam and show them what green leaves look like, David. All righty. Thank you.
Some of you may know about an organization called Honor Flight. Honor Flight is an organization in the United States that money is raised to support the transportation of World War II veterans, and now Korean, as well as disabled veterans, to visit Washington, D.C. We have a member of our board who is here who has been on one of those. There is a renewed effort by a group in the mid-Michigan area to help veterans from, I believe, Lansing and sort of across the state to participate in this, and hopefully do so in June and possibly in September. Again, it's called Honor Flight. On your chair is a pamphlet, little pamphlet like that, and it's Mid-Michigan Honor Flight. Gives you the information. It gives you a website. They are seeking not only dollars to support this cause, but also for you to identify any World War II veterans, Korean War veterans, or disabled veterans who will be allowed or given the opportunity to travel freely to and from Washington to visit the World War II Memorial. So that pamphlet right there tells you all that you need to know.
This comes together as a collaborative, folks. It's just not the college, it's not Mr. Troutman and myself and our guest speakers that come forward, but this is a program that takes about 6 to 9 months of intensive planning behind the scenes. I would like to extend some acknowledgments to the LST 393, which is the other museum here. Dan Weichel and John Stevenson have been good collaborators. They've worked hand in hand with the Silverside staff. And we have to thank the Silverside staff members. And they're listed there: Denise Hershaft, Peggy Maniotis, Mitch Nyberg, Teresa Folkmeyer. I don't know how we got folksier there. My fault. And Jack Fisher, who set this up, get this thing going, take care of this, answer the phone calls. This is really yeoman's efforts. So can we extend a thanks to them tonight? Of course, next slide we can see the director. Without his support, we would not be here tonight. Okay? We'll see you all next week. Be good. Hope for good weather. We'll all be here again. Take care.